quiet, potentially historic shift is unfolding across the Middle East, where a fast-moving slide toward open conflict has for now been arrested by a mix of backchannel diplomacy, cautious restraint, and competing geopolitical calculations. What looked like an inexorable march to military escalation instead revealed itself as a far more fragile and strategic phase, one in which regional capitals and outside powers are testing new limits of influence and control. At the center of this unfolding moment is President Donald Trump, who has married hardline public rhetoric with repeated invitations to negotiate. In public remarks during the height of the crisis, he combined a threat of force with an offer to strike a deal. He said, "They want to make a deal badly, and we'll see if we get there. They can't have nuclear weapons." He later added, "So I think we won. Now we have to get what. If we don't do that, we'll have to go a big step further." Those were that made clear that Washington still sees military pressure as an available tool, but also that it remains open to a negotiated resolution. That dual posture came into sharp focus with the rollout of a U.S.-led maritime initiative called Project Freedom, designed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy choke points, after weeks of severe disruption to commercial shipping. Project Freedom was presented as a humanitarian and strategic effort to restore safe passage for merchant vessels that had been effectively shut out by Iranian maritime measures. It involved a large deployment of naval and air assets intended to escort and protect neutral shipping through a corridor that is vital to global energy markets. But even before the operation could achieve its first clear successes, the mission encountered resistance not only from Tehran, but from a number of Washington's closest Gulf partners. Within days of the announcement, the White House unexpectedly paused parts of the plan, pointing to diplomatic progress with Tehran and the prospect of a broader agreement. Behind that public explanation lay a more complicated reality, a set of conversations, pressures, and limits set by Gulf governments that could not be ignored. Saudi Arabia and several other Gulf states signaled deep reluctance to be drawn into another open-ended regional war. According to officials familiar with the discussions, Riyadh refused to allow certain U.S. aircraft involved in Project Freedom to operate from Prince Sultan Air Base or to transit Saudi airspace for that particular mission. That decision to restrict operational access to a key American facility was a significant diplomatic move. For decades, U.S. military strategy in the region depended on near unrestricted access to allied territory and logistics. By placing new boundaries on that access, Gulf capitals made clear they will exercise greater agency when they judge their own security or economies are at risk. This is not a wholesale retreat from U.S. Gulf security ties. Gulf states remain closely linked to Washington on defense and intelligence, but they are also recalibrating relationships, pursuing independent policies, and expanding diplomatic pathways with other major powers, most notably China. In recent years, Riyadh and other Gulf capitals have sought to diversify where they shop for security, investment, and diplomatic cover. That diversification matters now because it gives those capitals leverage in how a regional crisis is managed. China's growing role in the region has been one of the most consequential shifts. In March 2023, Beijing brokered a landmark agreement that restored diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a deal that reshaped the mechanics of Middle Eastern diplomacy. Chinese diplomacy, led by prominent envoys in Beijing, positioned China as a mediator capable of bringing together rivals who had for decades cast each other as existential threat. With the latest crisis threatening to blow back into open warfare, Chinese officials reemerged as discreet interlocutors, shuttling messages, urging restraint, and encouraging the adversaries to return to the negotiating table. Those efforts were mirrored by urgent regional contacts. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud engaged in direct exchanges that emphasized cooperation and the necessity of averting wider war. Pakistan also played a quieter but important role, facilitating back-channel communication between Tehran and other capitals and helping coordinate positions among states that want to avoid an escalation that would destabilize the entire neighborhood. The diplomatic choreography has produced a temporary breathing space. Phone calls, shuttle diplomacy, and emergency meetings have pushed the crisis off the immediate cliff. Yet the underlying tensions remain stark. Military assets are still deployed across the Gulf. Conventional shipping remains vulnerable to missile, drone, and mine attacks. Political mistrust continues to run deep. And the calculus of escalation versus restraint is far from settled. That calculus reflects a fundamental division over how stability should be restored. U.S. military strategists argue that decisive use of force is necessary to deter attacks on shipping and regional facilities. Their logic rests on deterrence, demonstrate the costs of interference. So the behavior stops, restore freedom of navigation, and reestablish predictable conditions for global trade. Gulf leaders, however, are shaped by decades of costly and disruptive conflict. Many are deeply wary of being pulled into another prolonged war that would threaten energy infrastructure, scare off foreign investment, and worsen domestic economic pain. Their preference tilts toward de-escalation, containment, and a negotiated restraint, even if that path requires uncomfortable compromises and contingency arrangements. If regional rivals, those competing logics help explain why a symbolic refusal to grant basing or overflight for a particular mission can carry enormous political weight. Prince Sultan Air Base is more than a runway. It is a hub for surveillance, missile defense, refueling, and rapid response. Limits on access increase the logistical complexity of any American operation and force Washington to consider alternatives, shifting, basing, rerouting, or relying more heavily on naval assets at sea. Those are not trivial operational adjustments. They reflect a strategic rebalancing of how coalition operations can be assembled in the region. The recent flare-ups in the Gulf also underscore an uncomfortable reality. Iran remains capable of asymmetric disruption. Earlier incidents this year damaged regional military assets and, according to reports, injured U.S. personnel in the Gulf theater. Iranian forces, including missile and drone units and a network of regional proxies, can operate below the threshold of all-out conventional warfare while inflicting meaningful damage. That posture leaves Tehran both vulnerable to heavy conventional retaliation and resilient in its capacity to impose costs. Iran, for its part, is under enormous internal and external pressure. Years of sanctions, economic strangulation, and regional isolation have strained the Iranian economy and political system. Yet Tehran retains tools, missiles, drones, proxy relationships, and an experienced irregular warfare apparatus that complicate any straightforward military solution. That mix of vulnerability and capability is part of what makes the present diplomatic moment so delicate. Tehran may seek relief through negotiations, but it will also seek to preserve strategic leverage. What the parties are discussing in private matters. Reportedly, negotiators are exploring mechanisms to protect commercial shipping short of a broad ceasefire, agreements that might include designated safe lanes, limitation ends on certain types of military activity near the strait, and phased confidence building measures that can be monitored and verified. The idea is to create a set of practical, verifiable steps that reduce the immediate risks while buying time for a broader diplomatic settlement. If those mechanisms are adopted and enforced, the region could enter a period of uneasy but manageable stability, a precarious equilibrium in which deterrence and negotiation coexist. If they fail, the pathway back to wider military confrontation could narrow quickly, with unpredictable consequences for the region and the global economy. The stakes are enormous because the Strait of Hormuz is not an abstract strategic asset. It is a choke point through which a substantial portion of the world's maritime oil trade passes. Any prolonged disruption there would ripple through crude markets, energy prices, shipping insurance, and broader supply chains. The economic shock would be felt in trading rooms and fuel pummel peace around the world and could precipitate political and financial stress across multiple continents. Beyond the immediate economic impact, the current contest is a broader struggle over regional order and influence. For decades, U.S. power formed the backbone of Gulf security architecture. Today, that architecture is more crowded. China offers substantial economic incentives and a diplomatic channel that many regional leaders find attractive. Other states, Turkey, India, Pakistan, European powers, also play roles that complicate a binary contest between Washington and Tehran. Both governments are increasingly adept at balancing relationships, leveraging security ties with the United States while deepening economic and diplomatic connections with Beijing and others. No single power can fully shape the outcome. The United States retains unmatched conventional military capabilities in the region. China brings diplomatic leverage and economic clout. Regional states possess local know. Influence over basing and logistics and the immediate stakes of any conflict. The result is a multipolar environment in which decisions by Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha can be as consequential as those made in Washington, Tehran, or Beijing. That diffusion of power helps explain why diplomacy has once again been prioritized, at least temporarily. For Gulf leaders, the calculus is straightforward. Local stability is a precondition for economic recovery and domestic reform. For China, successful mediation enhances its global stature and deepens ties to energy suppliers and buyers. For Pakistan and other intermediaries, playing constructive roles preserves regional stability and limits spillover. For Washington, negotiated restraint can avoid the costs of a new open-ended ground war, even as it seeks to preserve deterrence. Yet diplomacy alone is not a panacea. Agreements must be verifiable, enforceable, and credible. They need mechanisms for monitoring and clear penalties for violations. They must also address the political questions that underlie the crisis, from Iran's regional posture and missile and drone capabilities to long-term security assurances and economic incentives that can provide Tehran with a face-saving exit from sustained confrontation. As this fragile pause holds, the principal actors find themselves at a strategic intersection. Washington is testing whether it can pressure Tehran while simultaneously coaxing an agreement. Tehran is weighing how much to concede without surrendering essential deterrent capabilities. Gulf capitals are insisting they will not be passive platforms for external military operations that could endanger their economies and populations. Beijing is positioning itself as a constructive broker while consolidating its role as an essential partner to multiple regional players. What happens next will depend on the willingness of all parties to convert private negotiations into enforceable arrangements. That requires compromise on both sides, robust verification and monitoring, and an effective way to manage incidents before they spiral. It also requires patience and disciplined messaging, public rhetoric that signals resolve without closing off diplomatic flexibility. The coming days and weeks will be a test of whether the region can institutionalize this fragile pause into something more durable. If it can, the period may be remembered as a turning point. The moment the Middle East began to rebalance toward a more plural, negotiated order in which regional actors exercise greater agency and outside powers operate with new constraints. If it cannot, the pause may prove only a brief respite before the return of deeper confrontation with far-reaching consequences. For now, the immediate imperative is simple and urgent. Preserve the breathing room that diplomacy has bought and use it to build practical, verifiable measures that reduce the risk of miscalculation. The alternative is too perilous, a collision in a narrow waterway that would send shockwaves across energy markets, economies, and international relations. That is the narrow, difficult path ahead, turning private bargains into public peace, translating strategic restraint into enforceable rules, and ensuring that a fragile pause does not become a prelude to a much larger conflict. The world will be watching the Gulf closely. The decisions made in back rooms and on tarmac flights may determine whether this moment is recorded as the time the region